So I think we'll get started now. Good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Baiano. I'd like to welcome you to the Child's Gallery Virtual Artist Talk with Joan Hall. She'll be discussing her current exhibition, Where Light Dances, on the Ocean and in My Memories. As I said, I'm Richard Baiano, president of Child's Gallery. The exhibition is currently on view at the gallery, open Tuesday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday, 11 a.m. through 5 p.m. It's quite an exciting installation, and I would invite everyone to come if they haven't seen it yet. I would like to remind everyone to stay on mute throughout the presentation. There will be a question and answer opportunity at the end of Joan's talk, and feel free to submit questions via the chat feature during the presentation, and we can make a note of them. I will do a very brief introduction of Joan and then turn the presentation over to her. Where Light Dances, on the Ocean and in My Memories is a very personal exhibition for Joan. Her mixed media sculptures and installations are inspired by her climate change advocacy and recent personal crises, building a story explored through cause and effect, control and surrender, love and loss. Joan is a lifelong sailor, and she uses her art to promote marine advocacy, primarily concerning the human impact on water quality. From her home and studio in Jamestown, Rhode Island, Joan sees the effects of climate change firsthand. Joan's large-scale sculptural works emphasize the materials of handmade paper, glass, and metal, and address her deep connection and concern for the Earth's oceans. She incorporates plastics and assorted trash found on the local beaches into holographic printing plates, which impress haunting images of human waste onto handmade paper. Joan also uses vibrant pigments, often in the form of paper pulp, to color her pieces in hues that mimic the destructive algae found propagating in non-native waters. So with that brief introduction, I will turn the talk over to Joan.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. And Richard, thank you for introduction. I've already crossed out some of the things I was going to say. So that was great. And I wanted to thank everyone at Child's Gallery for their support and for Richard's belief in my work. And especially Catherine, who, if you haven't read her press release, you should go to the gallery at some point and read it, because she writes about my work far better than I talk about it. But on that point, the first time I sailed out of the side of land, the vastness of the ocean had a profound effect on me. And I think that's a way that I was trying to duplicate. I think working large has been a way that I tried to duplicate that sensation of feeling so small in the universe. And I think when I'm working in the studio, I love to work large because I like to feel like I'm immersed in the work. All right, click. Come on. It's not. Please. Oh, there we go. Sorry. I start out by making large sheets of Japanese paper, and the paper is cooked and beat by hand in the traditional method, except for I just make really large sheets. Before I start talking about the exhibition, I wanted to share some of the images of the installation that I just did recently at the Waterfire Center in Providence. Algae Bloom is made up of 43 handmade paper printed panels, and they're laminated to Mylar and hand cut. Pulp painting is used to create marks that contrast with the graphic marks of the colograph plates. And each time I show the work, it grows by the addition of more panels. The concept for me is that just like Algae Bloom, this piece will always grow and change. I work a little differently. I use images that I record on my iPad from previous versions as a starting point. This was from the Newport Art Museum. I then start drawing in space with the panels. I don't make preliminary drawings at all. It's a very physical process as I sculpt these pieces, and they wave and form and develop into the next version. A lot of it is an intuitive response to the space where I'm working. The pieces are then installed with glass pins that I fire. This piece is about 40 feet long and it took 12 hours to install. My work and methodology is much like sailing. It's a balance between control and surrender. Here, the exhibition, Where Light Dances, is taken from the exhibition title is taken from Victoria Finley's book, Color, The Natural History of the Palette. And it referenced a passage detailing her childhood visit to the Chartres Cathedral and the stunning blue she recalled that reflected on the tiles from the stained glass. And her father said to her, "We still don't know how they make that blue." And I've been collecting dry pigments since the 1970s. And color is a very important element for me because I rely on it to enhance my concepts. So I'm just going to show a few images of the exhibition for those people who haven't had a chance to see it or can't see it due to the distance. And I'll go through that first for context of the pieces. Whoops. Did it go? There we go. I'm having problems with my thing. One thing I do is I do a lot of things differently. Like my installations, there's a certain amount of loss of control. But when I created the works for this exhibition, Richard saw the floor plan in my studio and I had every piece planned where it was supposed to go. The invasion of Hall Cove in the gallery is the third version. And I'm really interested in every time I install anything that I do where there's another version, that it's slightly different. Now, the first version of this was at the Newport Art Museum. The second version was at the Venice Biennale, where I added some larger vegetation forms. And Richard wanted me to put it up in the gallery. And I gave him an out at least 3 times saying, I'm going to put 500 to 600 holes in your wall. He said, no, I want it up. So it went up. And this references a photo that I took of invasive algae that covered the beach on the island where I live in Hall Cove. And it's a custom wallpaper is made from that photograph. It's almost like a giant sticker. It just sticks to the wall. And this algae was almost 2 feet deep. And it was of a foreign color. I was really kind of fascinated with it. And I found out later that this type of algae clings to ships, but because of the warming ocean, it's no longer dying off. And so when it reaches our waters, it's actually beginning to thrive. And I've noticed it in other beaches now. And this was probably taken maybe 5-6 years ago. And in recent conversations, with different people, I've come to learn that I'm not a linear thinker. I'm like more of a blender. At one point, Richard told me he wanted to know how my mind works, and it's not an easy to answer because, I think that's normal for me and the rest of the world, I guess. Such as in Love, Loss, and Serenity, I started out with the idea of thinking about all the bottle caps I had collected on the beach. And I read a story about the unexplained dying off of sea urchins. So those two things were 2 parts that were going to become apart because sea urchins are kind of round. And I wanted the work to be a circular motif. And I found a map of Rome from 1472 in my late husband's PhD thesis. Rome was a distorted circle. So I created a plate of the map, embossed it with bottle caps and plastic detritus. I then cut apart the map as I assembled this piece. And my work develops through the colliding and layering of meaning, of information, and my perspective of the world as I then absorb it and contemplate about the past. Another wallpaper piece is Collision. Now, in the gallery is this closet, or it used to be a closet or a dressing room, I guess. And everyone has done something different. So it's almost like this was a fun thing to do. Who knows if I'll ever, show this piece again anywhere, but it was something that I conceived specifically for that closet. And again, it was from a photograph I took of manatees in the Keys. And in this piece, I started exploring the use of 3D printing of found objects. The propeller, one of those propellers is the actual plastic propeller I found. The rest are 3D duplicates, as are the tiny ones on the back wall. There are actually 100 of them attached to the wall. And I'm finding that that's a really interesting addition to my work, and I'm not sure where I'm going to go with it, but I think it's something I'll be exploring more and more. As someone who was trained in printmaking, I find that repetition is really important in my work and how I construct my things. So that's, even though I consider them as sculptures, that printmaking background is very ingrained in my work ethic. Besides exploring the past and the present, I also fantasize about the future. I have lots of time in my studio in Jamestown, and many of the works in the exhibition allude to the idea that aquatic organisms are already breaking down plastic, and new species are forming, at least in my mind. So microplastics are in the food chain, and most recently, it's been found in human blood. And just the other day on the island, I saw a sign that said plastic will be the major ingredient in our children's food. Not exactly the most positive thing to read. On a Sea of Tears and Going, Going, Gone too, because there was another version of this that was on the wall. It was not a three-dimensional piece. Explore the phenomena that occurs when coral dies. It's been discovered that before coral bleaches, it flashes these brilliant, almost psychedelic, unnatural colors and then dies. And it was discovered through time-lapse cameras. I mean, scientists didn't know anything about it until these time-lapse cameras caught this. And that really fascinates me. So in doing the exhibition, I wanted to have a piece for the window that the light would come through, but was, and it didn't block it and was dimensional. And so I came about, this piece was made specifically for the gallery. I think of books as a record of time. And when I did the first showing of Ocean Libraries, when I did a first showing of Going, Going, Gone, there was another piece as a part of it. So I wanted to create something that also referenced the reefs. So Ocean Libraries are cast from two books: The History of Art by Jansen, that had no women artists in it, and the version I was taught from, and the 1970s, which was in the 1970s, and a book of my late husband's on the history of religious art, which are, to me, are metaphors for human responses to the climate crisis, misinformation, and a lack of faith, or maybe an act of faith, I might say. So I should go back again. Each of the books are cast of handmade paper made from Mark's shirts and ties, and there are roses embedded in the paper, and the books are covered with sand collected from around the world, and some with plastic detritus. Diminishing sand is related to coral dying, because parrotfish eat organisms off the coral, and bits of coral that they digest is excreted. So no coral, no tropical sand. I never thought that sand could be precious. There's a great article from the New York Times about how the beaches in Florida are running out of sand, and that they tried to buy it from the Bahamas and were refused. And so they've been experimenting with making it out of ground glass. The paper's a great source of material. And of course, the pandemic added a new pollution to our oceans: masks and gloves. And when I cut over hundreds of masks and gloves during the pandemic, because I didn't go anywhere for one reason probably I had lots of time. for this work. And when I assemble the sculptures, I not only work on the wall, but I also work on the floor. Excuse me, I'm really stumbling around tonight. Reef vignettes, they're the smallest and most delicate looking works in the show. And I combined cut shapes of aquatic vegetation intertwined with images from the 1800s illustrations from the book Art Forms in Nature by Ernest Haeckel. Hidden in the plants are shapes referencing plastic detritus found on the beach. I really like this sort of colliding of past and present. I'm often asked if I started working small and increased in size, but I actually think the exact opposite. I like to work really large, and then I'm reined in to work smaller and smaller and try to figure out how to do that. And I'm really pleased with these small vignettes. I think they're extremely delicate, and to me, they feel like things I've seen in the ocean. Oops, I guess I'm sorry about that. You missed this. I didn't advance the slide. My problem. So here are the three pieces I just talked about. Weather patterns are becoming more severe due to climate change. The title N41-29-277 West 71-20-255 refers to the GPS coordinates of where my boat sank on August 25th, 2020. I was racing my Alarian in Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island, when the fleet was hit by a microburst that was only 1/4 of a mile wide. The wind went from 70 to 70 knots in seconds, and the storm lasted only a few minutes. My boat sank in 60 feet of water along with another. I visualized my boat sitting on the bottom of the ocean with aquatic vegetation swirling around it. The experience made me contemplate my own mortality and think about how these new weather patterns will affect our future. Curator Edward Saywell asked me if I thought in 2D or 3D. I had to think about that. It's a question no one's ever asked me. And I realized that I don't think like a traditional printmaker. I don't think like a traditional sculptor. I start with an idea that I imagine in certain colors, and I only make drawings in parts and pieces. And then I flip-flop from 2D to 3D and back again in developing the work. For example, in the making of this piece, I collected plastic detritus and ropes that I embossed into the plate. And Richard gave me his boyhood collection of metal bottle caps from the Jersey Shore. I think he was a little, he was a little worried when I ran these through the press, but I won't say what else you did. So anyway, I've lost my place. So with his assistant and that of Eric and Jody Sarma, who lived just a few doors down, I had them help me put these bottle caps on the plate. I'm not sure how many there were. Richard probably knows exactly how many there were.
212.
How many?
212.
See, I knew you would know. And he took probably 12 with him. He asked if he could have some. So I let him. I still have them, by the way. I've still been using them. And so these 3D images became 2D embossments as a starting point to develop the plates further. Come on, advance. I then print the plates multiple times on my handmade paper. I was once asked about at a printmaking conference while on a panel by a person with a rather condescending tone, did I ever make additions? I said yes, but they all end up in the same piece. And I thought, why do there have to be rules? I've never liked rules. And you could even see on these are the plates that are a part of this piece. And the 4 small plates are, and again, they're versions of the same idea. And those circular numbers that you see in the plates are the GPS coordinates. So the prints are then like on the left and the right are the prints, and they're then laminated to Mylar to give them structure. And then I begin to subtract information or create specific shapes by cutting. When I have several sections cut, I begin to construct them into 3D sculptures by undulating and weaving the parts and pieces together. There are numerous sections, and I add and subtract the translucent layers to achieve the desired results. Sometimes I print pieces that don't end up being in the work because I don't think they fit. They don't, there's something I don't like about them. Let's see, trying to get this to go, okay. And the installation of my work is a whole nother project. I think, when you install your work, you need to also think about that. And so I make a template as a guide for color-coded Velcro. I love Velcro. And this N41 West 71 has 8 components to make up the final work. The sort of 5 pod-like pieces give a certain amount of dimension to the large pieces that are like as the one that's in the box. They're like 3 large sections and 5 of the small pod-like sections. And here is a detail where you can see the colors overlapping and creating new colors. And at times I paint with paper pulp before I print, and sometimes I print afterwards. And that is it. Oops, last slide.
So Joan, thank you for that. You touched on what was going to be my very first question for you. And I'd like to have you elaborate a little bit more on that. For those of you that may not be aware, we recently participated in the IFPDA, which is the International Fine Print Dealers Association, and Joan had a rather large installation there. And it's really about the medium of prints. And it's always very interesting to see people's first reaction when they see Joan's work, because they are indeed prints, just not what we think of as prints. So what I wanted to ask you is if you consider yourself a printmaker, a sculptor, or a combination of the two.
Well, I think I'm a combination of the two, because when I come to realize that I think both 3D and 2D. And what's interesting, when I was training, I trained as a printmaker, but I was doing ceramics. And then I went to graduate school where you had to choose back in the 70s. And I was like somewhat, I wasn't quite satisfied. I actually was printing on Japanese paper, ripping holes in it, and then layering things together. It's like, I just couldn't deal with a flat sheet of paper. So, and then I learned about handmade paper and never went back, because handmade paper was like using ceramics, but I didn't have to fire it, because you can make sheets, you can cast it. It's, all these different ways that you can work. And so, yeah, so I think I'm somewhere in between.
So yeah, I don't think I was aware of how the handmade paper entered into your work. So that started when you were in graduate school?
Yeah. I saw a presentation by Howie Clark and his wife from Twin Rockers Paper, and they were talking, it's kind of an interesting story. I was sitting there and they were talking about how, all about handmade paper. And I kind of mumbled under my breath, well, I'm going to have to sell my firstborn in order to, afford all that equipment. And this guy next to me asked me for a sheet of paper. I handed it to him. He tore a section off. He then put it in his mouth, chewed it up, spit it out, and slapped it on the chair in front of him and said, I just made paper. And I said, who are you? And he said, Garner Tellis, which is sort of one of the, the heroes of early paper making. And he ran a workshop out in California. So in between my second, or I guess my first and my second year of grad school, or second and third, I can't remember, I went out there and learned how to make paper with him, basically using was like a giant pulper. I came back and I made a beater out of a, actually I used a blender in graduate school. That drove everybody crazy, but I eventually made one out of a trash can using a boat motor and propeller, until I eventually did. I now own all the equipment like the Twin Rockers has, but not back then. But he changed my life, because he was like, you don't need all that equipment. So that was like 1977.
Fascinating. And how did the collecting of the paper pulp start? The colors?
Oh, the pigments?
Yeah, the pigments.
When I was in grad school, I worked with a professor. His name was Michael Newshog, and he studied under Lazansky. And Mauricio Lazansky insisted that everyone learned how to make their own inks from dry pigments, which nobody taught that. And when I went there, Mike didn't teach it, and I was the TA in printmaking, and I was cleaning some things out, and I saw all these pigments shoved in the back of, like they were dusty, and they were these bags, and they were shoved in the back of the cabinet. And I pulled them out and said, can I have these? And I started putting them in paper pulp. And at that time, when they were selling pigments for pulp, you couldn't get the kind of intense colors I was getting because I was using the actual pure dry pigments in the pulp. And I still do that today. I collect them. I have a whole cabinet full. Some aren't even made anymore. In fact, the piece that was at the IFPDA, the large one, that bright yellow that was in there is actually a toxic yellow that you can no longer buy. It's a cadmium yellow, which kind of went well, conceptually with the piece. Times are changing.
So one of the things that I've always wondered about when I've seen your work is how it's evolved over time and how this whole process started. And it's interesting for me to see the paper, the printed paper, because obviously the final piece doesn't resemble that at all. But again, back to the questions about are they additioned? It's just very fascinating to me that something that starts out as a print ends up creating what you create. So how did that develop?
Oh my goodness.
The process.
What I'm doing now, or just how I started working with, oh my goodness, that question.
I know it's a big question. But
well, okay, no, I can remember. Actually, I have to think back because it was a while ago. I was doing a lot of painting with paper pulp on my pieces. And then I got Mylar because I wanted to actually try doing some layers of colors, almost like a traditional way of printmaking, which didn't work very well. So I had this Mylar, and I had gotten ill with cancer. This is way back in 2005. And I didn't have the energy I used to have. And for some reason, I got the idea to glue the Japanese paper I had to the Mylar, because I was doing some pieces that were like rectangular, and rectangular pieces really don't thrill me that much. But I had to do it with the Japanese paper because it wasn't structurally strong. So I glued it to the Mylar, and then I started cutting it. And I got fascinated with cutting. And there's some really great, interesting articles about repetition and trauma that I find extremely interesting, because in the last year, I've done, probably thousands of cuttings because it's been it was a way to pass time and, get enough objects together to create things for these pieces. So it started like that. And the pieces first were cut and irregular. And then I started realizing that I could go dimensional with them. And once I went dimensional, that to me was like, that's where I wanted to be. And it took a long time to sort of evolve into that, where I am now, I guess is a good way to say it.
Well, what strikes me about it is it's a very, I think of it as a very, it's developed. I mean, you are at your peak, I think, because, and again, one of the comments that we had at the print fair, which was Joan's piece, was an absolute showstopper, literally, was how unique and how different they are. So we have a question from Michelle Samore, and she says, what is it that draws you to work with paper pulp? Do you see relationships between the use of water that is required to make the paper and your relationship to the water as a sailor?
Well, I've often told people that I play in the water and I work in the water. And so that's part of my interest in paper. But I think a lot of it is just, when I first started printing, I wanted to not just have that white sheet of paper. I never did well when I had to do painting with a canvas that you gessoed and it was white. So I love the fact that the paper starts as, that I can already start making art in essence, or with the paper, that there's something embedded in it. I don't know if I answered that question exactly right, Michelle. I'm trying. So did that answer the question? I'm not sure if it did. I fell in love with the fact that it's so malleable, and it gave it's like it allowed you to start with a piece of paper that wasn't just a white rectangle. I guess that's the way to put it. And so when I learned that, I became fascinated. And the more I learned, then I learned that I could cast it just like ceramics. So I like the fluidity to it. And, that's a relationship to water also, I think.
It's interesting because I don't think of making paper in relation to making ceramics, but I guess it's clay and pulp are probably similar.
There are a lot of similarities. You can cast it, you can form it, you can sheet it. It's just you don't have to fire paper. It's so much easier than ceramics.
So
Plus, I can recycle it.
the title is On the Ocean and in My Memories. I mean, I know from knowing you well that you use art as a way to process emotions. And so I'm wondering, how this exhibition helped you to channel the loss of Mark and also you're surviving from cancer.
I think, well, the exhibition was doing this exhibition. Mark, we planned this 2 years ago and Mark had wanted to be here. So as I was making this show, there's a part of me that wanted him to become a part of it. And so that's somehow the way that the map of Rome and the idea of how, the fall of the Roman Empire, and Mark had studied, he was an old master's expert. And then the idea of using his shirts and ties to process his passing. And the show, working on the show and IFPDA, it filled a void in the past year. And it's been, it's been cathartic.
Yeah. Well, and it also has led to some wonderful work.
Oh, thank you.
So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask Joan? They can just unmute and ask if they like.
Well, I just want to say, Richard, that Kelly and Andy Trivers are sitting in front of one of my older pieces.
Okay. And where is that located?
St. Louis.
Oh, okay. She's gonna show it.
She could go fix the lights. Anyways, I can see it, so I wanted to make that comment.
Yeah. So titling seems to be an important part of your work as well.
Yes, it really is, because when I was starting to work on this show, I knew I wanted this collision of information about the loss of, things on our planet and the loss of Mark, and I couldn't figure it out. So when I found that passage in that book about color, that she wrote, Where Light Dances, that struck me first. And then I came up with On the Ocean and in My Memories. And it just felt like it really sort of married these two ideas that were sort of colliding in the work for the show.
So I see that William Evertston has something that he would like to ask.
Yeah, hi, Joan.
Hi, William.
I was curious to hear you talking a little bit about your, the use of Mylar in the works, and I was wondering if there's any relationship, because you also mentioned the amount of plastics in the in our oceans and waterways now. Did that idea that there's so much plastics play any part in the fact that you started using Mylar as a support in the work?
Actually it didn't. But people have asked me, you're using plastic in your work, but you're talking about, plastic in the ocean. And my answer is plastic is here to stay, but it's how we dispose of it and, and how we're responsible about it. So like all the parts and pieces that I cut, believe it or not, I save them and they end up in my other works as bits and pieces. So it didn't really have, it wasn't a conceptual decision. It was it was a studio decision in order to figure out a way to be able to use this transparent paper and not have it be fragile.
Interesting. So I'm curious about, what your overall views are about where we are as a society in terms of climate change. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about it?
Depends which day you ask me. Uh, I'm somewhat optimistic being living in Rhode Island because of the number of things that they do here in Narragansett Bay and what I've seen. And I'm somewhat optimistic when I've been down in the Keys and I've seen bays that at one point you didn't want to like put your foot in them that now are crystal clear. But then again, then it's like the fact that the microplastics are getting in our food chain. And, reading that statement wasn't so far from the truth because I attended a conference and these young children at the island school in the Luther Islands were cutting open fish, and in the guts of the fish were plastic. And this was like maybe 7 years ago. And I thought it's going to end up in our food chain. So when I recently read that they're finding it in our blood, that I went, okay, here it comes. So that's when I'm pessimistic. So, but
Have you ever? No, go on.
I was just going to say, but basically I'm an optimist about the world. I mean, beauty is a very important part of my work. So, I use it to camouflage danger, because beauty in nature can be dangerous, but it's also to attract you in, and also because I find the ocean incredibly beautiful. So it plays all these different little parts in my work.
So speaking of the ocean, Liz asked how your work has changed since you moved from St. Louis to Rhode Island.
It's become more dimensional. That's one thing. But also I look at the ocean every single day, and there are some colors that I photograph constantly that, I'm slowly drawing into my work. I'm trying to figure out how to do some pieces that when I see the bay look pink at sunsets, I can't quite figure out how to make that color yet, but it'll appear at some point.
So speaking of making color, do you ever make your own pigments?
Yes, I do. Oh, not make my own pigments. No, I buy the pigments, but I'll make my own ink with them sometimes. But no, that I haven't gone that far. It's kind of like I don't grow flax and make paper from that. It's like, and I buy, it's like I usually, as far as I go, is to use Japanese paper.
Have you seen the pigment collection at the Harvard Art Museum?
I have not, and I want to. It's on my bucket list.
It's pretty amazing. They have pigments from all the centuries. It's pretty remarkable.
Well, I think maybe now I might have some time that might be something I'll do, because I have some pigments that in my collection that, they're from Africa, they're from, they're all from all over the world. And I just love to look at them. They're beautiful.
So I have two questions, a little bit like what is it in the actor's studio when the hosts ask two specific questions to the guests. I've come up with these two questions that I ask every artist during a talk, and William, in your next talk, you'll get these two questions as well.
Oh, that's not fair. He gets to know ahead of time.
So how do you feel about the recent drive by institutions to add more diversity to their exhibitions and collections?
Well, being a woman, studying art when I was given an art history book where they didn't include any women artists in it. I think it's important, but I also think it's important not to swing the pendulum too far in one direction, that there needs to be a certain amount of quality all across the board, which means also not forgetting white men.
Well, I think that makes sense. The other question that I have, and I know that you've spent a large part of your career as an educator, which is what advice would you give to young artists?
Never stop working, even if you're teaching, Liz. It's like, and also to follow your own heart. As an artist, you got to make what is a projection of how you perceive the world. And, if you always are trying to follow the moment of what everybody else is doing, and constantly changing, I don't think you're staying true to your own vision. And, for me, the climate change, oddly enough, it came from the fact that when I had cancer, at the same time, soon afterwards, I was actually asked to do a piece for the Washington University's Barnes Hospital's nursing school. And I did this research about this Aztec book that they had in there. They actually had it in their medical library. That was the first medical text. And it had plants from like the first illustrations of medical plants that were used for healing. And then I read an article about how there are plants and animals in the ocean that they think will be the next cures for cancer. So part of me said, okay, so here we are, we might be finding cures for cancer in the ocean, of which Aztec doctors a long time ago used plants and vegetation in nature. And I thought, and now we're also killing the ocean. So I lost my train of thought there.
Well, no, I think that makes total sense. Just as an aside, have you heard that in New York Harbor, they're seeding the harbor with oysters, which is filtering the water?
Yes, I did read that. And, I've even noticed that here in Rhode Island, that in Narragansett Bay, there are a lot more oyster farms, and the bay is becoming very clean. And, it's like, and I do love to eat oysters. I'm not sure about, how that's affecting us, but what can we say? It's like some things you just kind of forget about or whatever. But no, I think it's really interesting about the different things. In fact, there are in the bay here, they have these like traps that are trapping the plastic in the bay. They're like these big, I don't know how to explain them, but as the water goes through, they're filtering and gathering the plastic, and then they dump them. So, there's hope. But, the largest amount of plastic comes from Asia, and plastic travels on the ocean currents all the way around the world. So there's a really interesting book called Moby Duck, not Moby Dick, that is a very interesting account of these bath toys that fell off of a freighter, and how people were in search for them because a year later, they were appearing on like the Maine coast. And people were selling them on eBay and whatever else. But the book is an interesting read.
Interesting. So, as your work has continued to evolve over the years, we're wondering where you see it evolving in the future, in particular, as it relates to the impending climate crisis.
Well, I continue to read articles, and they seem to fuel my imagination for other pieces. And I also have an underwater drone that we haven't really been able to use much yet. And that's on my future now. I'll have to wait till spring, of course, when we can get back out in the water. But I'm curious to see what kind of images we pull up from that, and I'll go from there.
So one of the things that is always very exciting for me in seeing Joan's work is each time a piece is installed, deinstalled, and then reinstalled, it does change a little bit. And I do want to say that in particular with the piece Hall's Cove, what people don't get to appreciate in the photograph are these projections of these metal pieces that are related to the coral and the reefs. And what's very exciting is that piece will have a permanent home at the gallery in the upstairs in the print department in a small room upstairs, so one will be able to experience it in person. So yeah, so that'll be fun. I always try to have a piece installed in my office because it's hard for the work to translate in a two-dimensional digital image. And what I will say about the works, which is really very difficult again to see two-dimensionally, is just how beautiful they are as objects, and in a way much like stained glass. I think, back to your short analogy. Catherine had a wonderful question, which is that she's wondering what new trash you're finding on the ocean these days, just like you found masks during the pandemic. Anything new popping up?
Not really, but the last time I was gathering down in Florida, I really like the Florida in the tropics because because of the heat and the salt, it gets broken down more. It's getting smaller and smaller, which is a little frightening. I mean, it's like, after a storm, I can find big things. And actually, when I'm down there, if there's a big windstorm or a rainstorm, the first thing I do is I'm out on the beach. I'm a little, I have a little odd view of my vacation. So no, I have not gotten super interesting things yet, but I have picked up things occasionally that have come from like other countries. Like when I was down doing a project in Louisiana, I found containers that said product of Haiti. So, that things are going around, but, now that we can travel more, I'm hoping to maybe do some travel to some other, like maybe go down into the Caribbean again, which I haven't been to for, since the pandemic. So it's on my list.
I was not aware that that Florida is having an issue with sand. As you probably, as everyone here would have known, I grew up on the Jersey Shore, so I grew up literally less than a mile from the ocean, and I still, as soon as I get home, I can smell the ocean. It's just everywhere. But when I was a kid, in Jersey, they put these reefs. They build these reefs that's meant to prevent erosion. But what they ended up having, what ended up happening was the sand would get pulled out into the ocean by the currents that were created from it. So literally every year, every few years, they put these machines in the middle of the ocean and they pump the sand back onto the beach.
Yeah, and this if you go to the website and you go to the Newport Art Museum exhibition, there's like in that catalog, it cites the article that I read about the sand in Florida. And I mean, I never thought about that it could be finite. And it's exactly that. They were dredging it and putting it back on.
Yeah.
But then it got to a point that however far out they were dredging, they no longer could find it. So were trying to buy it from the Bahamas. And the Bahamians said, forget it.
Well, the thing is, the sand went from being white sand from when I was a kid to now being brown sand because it's taken so deep from the water.
Now that's a little scary. Yeah,
No,
it's like you never think about sand being finite. And then I read also because of all the building construction, that sand is being depleted because of that. And I went, because it's used in making concrete.
Interesting.
So, the world is all interconnected. And I think that's one of the things that in my work, even though I'm colliding all these different kinds of thoughts, the underlying idea is that, it's all connected somehow. The past is connected to the future, to the present.
So we mentioned Jamestown, Rhode Island. Did you know that when you were moving to Jamestown, it was its own little artists colony?
I did not. In fact, down on my end is sort of I had a friend, of course, who lived here, who I taught with for 20 years, and he's the one who sort of told us about the property that we got. But, since I've lived here, it's like there are glass blowers and, there are a lot of artists on Jamestown. It's very interesting. And collectors.
That's true. So are you going to take a break after the exhibition?
I'm taking one. I don't have any immediate deadlines. Let's put it that way. I have got something, in the future that I have to work on, but it'll actually give me some time. I'm thinking that the piece 41 North, and of course the piece that was in the IFPDA about contemplating mortality, they're all based on those same plates of continuing to making those pods and those sections so that at some point I can have a different big installation, much like algae bloom, and maybe cut some more panels from algae bloom, because people will ask me to show, and I want to, I won't show it again unless it has more panels. It always has to grow. It always has to be that the next time I install it, it's different, because that is the one thing about my installations. They, especially because they're installed with pins, they will change every time they go up, unlike the fixed pieces that are in the gallery. But it doesn't stop me from adding to those.
So I do want to point out, and I want to ask you a little bit about it, Joan, which is that on this final page we have up, there's an interview with with Joan and Jan Castro. So I would recommend that, and it's in Sculpture Magazine, which I think is really interesting. So I would mention, I would just suggest to people that they click on the link for that article and read it, and you'll hear more about what we're talking about today. Overall, were you pleased with the article?
Yes, I was, and that's where when Jan was interviewing me, and Jan, if you're on, I feel very sorry for Jan because I really am. I mean, when we were going back and forth, I realized I am so not a linear thinker, and I have to it's hard for me to rein the thoughts in. I mean, it's like, even though I have notes here, I forgot things, whatever. I go off on tangents. Catherine's laughing. That's why I said, Catherine, I love your writing about my work because you kind of pulled it into this wonderful statement about my work. So yeah,
Well,
but I was pleased.
But I've seen, contrary to what you just said, you actually are very good about speaking about your artwork, and it's very fascinating to listen to, especially as we were at the fair hearing you talk about it multiple times. You should tell people the story about when they would ask questions to us and you were there.
Yeah, that was kind of fun.
People would ask us questions about things, and we said, we can just ask the artist, and they get all nervous.
Yeah, it was kind of fun. One woman was great, though. She was having some great explanation about how I made my work, and I was dying to listen to what she thought, how she thought I produced it. So that was kind of fun. And the other thing about my work is I'm also very aware of paper, and I mean, anyone who's a collector of works on paper, they're usually, under glass to protect them. But because I paint acrylic through the Japanese paper to adhere to the Mylar, it actually seals it, and it seals the negative ions in the air out from attacking the paper. So the paper is cannot be, it doesn't break down, doesn't get damaged.
How about fading? Does it protect from fading in the sunlight?
Well, all I can say is, I've had several pieces, like the one piece I have of mine that's here in my house, I've installed for the last 6 years, hasn't changed a bit. And one of the things is that I use dry pigments. I don't use dyes. Dyes are subject to fading, and which there are some paper artists in the beginning, and I don't know if they still do it, but they would make paper with cloth and use the dyes from the cloth, and that will fade. So I've always used dry pigments in the coloring of my pulp.
Interesting. So we're getting close to 7. Does anyone have any further questions? Did Captain make an appearance, Joan?
You guys didn't see him. He did come over and sort of nudge me on the leg and look at me, but he did not make an appearance like he usually does. No, he did not. Put it this way, he didn't make a vocal appearance.
Captain is her dog.
Yeah.
Well, I want to just thank everyone for joining us this evening, and Joan, I really want to thank you for all of your hard work and putting on such a spectacular show. I think we're all in awe of your ability, and we look forward to seeing you grow and develop more.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
And thanks everyone for coming.